With Sergio Perez finally being ousted from Red Bull in favour of Liam Lawson, and Isaac Hadjar being promoted to the Racing Bull seat alongside Yuki Tsunoda, we now have our completed 2025 grid all laid out in front of us. So I thought it would be a great time to do a tier list of all 10 teams' driver lineups. Very original, I know, but in a season where theoretically the cars are going to be closer than they ever have been in this current set of regulations, the drivers should be more important than ever. So going in alphabetical order, we're starting with Alpine. With Pierre Gasly and Jack Doohan for next year, I've got them rated as a D tier. I'd say on paper it's looking like a pretty significant downgrade on what they had last year with Pierre Gasly and Esteban Ocon behind the wheel. Obviously they had Esteban Ocon announced as departing the team quite early in the year after a shunt between him and Pierre at the Monaco Grand Prix, but focusing on what they've actually got for next year. Pierre Gasly obviously coming off the back of an incredibly strong end to 2024. You'd hope that he's going to be able to continue that performance into 2025, alongside Jack Doohan, who we don't know an awful lot about in terms of how he's actually going to perform in F1. In Formula 2, he finished in 6th place in 2022 and then finished in 3rd place in the championship in 2023, before last year just being Alpine's reserve driver for the full season. And in his most recent Formula 2 season, where he did finish in 3rd, he was behind Frederic Vesti and Theo Pourchaire, who both haven't made the step up into Formula 1. So you could say that that was somewhat of an uncompetitive Formula 2 season. But I think if you look at the fact that Jack Doohan hadn't got a drive for the entirety of last year, it must have been in Alpine's plans to promote him for the 2025 season, maybe get him embedded in the team a little bit before the 2026 regulations come. And of course that'll be a massive change for Alpine with them switching to the Mercedes engines. But when it comes to Gasly and Doohan, I'd say I'm kind of expecting it to be reminiscent of an Albon versus Sargent or an Albon versus Latifi, in terms of Gasly's going to be performing probably in the upper midfield, whereas I see Jack Doohan potentially being a little bit further back. The one positive of that is that they are unlikely to be sharing the same parts of the track, the same tarmac for much of the season, so I guess Alpine will avoid the sort of coming together of teammates that they saw with Esteban and Pierre. But yeah, quite an uninspiring lineup, I would say, and definitely a D tier for me. Aston Martin with Alonso and Stroll, I'm putting in the C tier. We're moving into another year of Alonso and Stroll. Alonso, I think, having quite an underrated 2024. He obviously finished miles in front of any of the rest of the drivers who were outside of the top 4 teams last year. He finished 9th in the championship in the end. Unfortunately, the Aston Martin car performance truly dropped off a cliff towards the end of the year, and so he was unable to really capitalise on what was an amazing start to the season. Alongside Lance Stroll, who is somehow once again stealing a drive in Formula 1. I say somehow, it's obvious. We all know why he's still in Formula 1. But if you were to put 2 Fernando Alonsos in a team, you'd obviously see this driver pairing being up towards the A or even S tier. But with Stroll in the team, it gets severely hampered. Stroll having an absolutely miserable 2024 with countless errors, countless silly mistakes that you just don't expect to see from someone who's been in Formula 1 for as long as he has. I don't really have to say too much more about Lance Stroll. Everyone gets the picture at this point. Similar to Gasly and Doohan, and similar to a lot of the teams on the grid for next year, you do kind of see quite a defined 1-2 dynamic between the drivers, so that does help them somewhat. But yeah, as long as Aston Martin are employing Lance Stroll, they're not going to be able to really achieve the lofty ambitions that the team seem to have with the amount of investment they're putting in to the new wind tunnel and to getting Adrian Newey into that position. So yeah, C tier for Aston Martin. Ferrari next with Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton. It can't be anything other than S tier. Leclerc obviously growing and growing as a driver, really fulfilling that potential that it looked like he was going to have in Formula 1 when we saw him in GP2. He had an absolutely dominant season there, and he's just going from strength to strength. Last season, for me, the second best driver on the grid, just behind Max Verstappen, who needs no introduction really. Hamilton obviously coming into the team off the back of what you'd say is probably one of his poorest seasons in Formula 1, so perhaps has a point to prove coming into the Ferrari team, but still you can't discredit the fact that he is a 7-time world champion. He has got so much experience in the sport, and bringing that to the powerhouse that is Ferrari, you'd think that this is going to be a match made in heaven. I feel like if you were to give an unlimited budget to someone and tell them to pick any 2 drivers to be in a team together on the grid right now, Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton is a solid shout. Obviously, Max Verstappen would definitely be in that conversation, but Charles and Lewis, 2 of the best drivers over the last few years, I think it's fair to say. I'd say the only issue with them together could be teammate dynamics. You know, Charles and Lewis both used to being #1 drivers at their respective teams coming together. We're currently unsure how they're going to work together as teammates, but 2 incredibly quick drivers, it can't be anything other than an S tier for those guys. Haas up next with Esteban Ocon and Oliver Bearman. I'm putting them down as C tier. Ocon obviously getting dropped last year by Alpine, somewhat unfairly I would say. Fortunately, Haas came in to swoop him up to replace Nico Hülkenberg alongside rookie Oliver Bearman, who we obviously saw take part in a couple of cameo races last year, 1 for Ferrari at Saudi Arabia and 2 for Haas, generally performing admirably in those races where he only had a day or 2 to prepare for the race. So it'll be really cool to see him jump into a full-time drive. And I feel like over the course of the season, it's likely that we'll see Esteban and Oliver being fairly close on track, maybe pushing each other to be better, and hopefully that results in a net benefit for Haas. Esteban, having his history that he does with teammates, might end up setting them back if they are to be close next year, but I do think that it's a solid driver lineup. I've put them in C tier, but just below Aston Martin, because I feel like the difference between Alonso and Ocon is big enough that Bearman being slightly better than Stroll perhaps doesn't quite put them above in the tier list. McLaren now with Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri. It's a pretty obvious S tier if you ask me. Norris is coming off the back of a season where he's finally got his first wins in Formula 1 and getting his first taste of a title fight with Max Verstappen. That'll be some good learning for him going forward. Oscar Piastri similarly getting his first wins in Formula 1 this season, and he's really embedding himself in the sport. His 3rd season in Formula 1 going into next year, and these guys of course won the Constructors' Championship together last year, a very strong pairing in Formula 1. I've got them in S tier but just below Ferrari, because I think when it comes to Formula 1, pace is the most important thing, and Leclerc and Hamilton I would put over Norris and Piastri as things stand currently. But the thing that brings McLaren maybe slightly closer to Ferrari than you might expect, at least in my opinion, is that we have seen that they work together as a team. Other than in Hungary when Lando was refusing to let Oscar pass, we have seen team orders work between the drivers. They seem to work together well, and I feel like when you're fighting for a Constructors' Championship, that is incredibly important. And if Lando Norris is to fight for a Drivers' Championship next year, then he might hope that Oscar Piastri is going to help him out in that. But you could argue with Oscar moving into his 3rd season now in Formula 1, potentially he might be a little bit more consistent next year, a bit quicker, and kind of tread on the toes of Lando Norris, but only time will tell with that one. Mercedes with George Russell and Kimi Antonelli, I'm putting in B tier. Mercedes obviously have an incredibly large Lewis Hamilton shaped hole to fill for next year. You'd expect George Russell to sort of step up into that team leader role. He had an incredibly strong 2024, beating Lewis Hamilton over the course of the season, and that's including having some bad luck with his disqualification in Belgium and his retirement at the British Grand Prix. So Russell looking very strong going into next year. Kimi Antonelli, obviously one of the prodigy talents coming into Formula 1 for next year, has been compared to the likes of Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen as he's risen through the ranks to get to Formula 1. The thing that I think is going to let Mercedes down a little bit next year is that we saw throughout the 2024 season that even though Lewis Hamilton was struggling, he still generally had the pace over Russell when it came to race trim, despite the fact that George Russell was incredibly strong in qualifying on Saturdays, gaining that sort of Mr. Saturday reputation. I do think that the race pace is a little bit lacking still from George, and that might see them struggle into next year when you've got the likes of Kimi Antonelli alongside him, a rookie stepping into a massive role at Mercedes. Mercedes, it wouldn't surprise me if Kimi was to be a little bit rough around the edges next year. I do think that he's going to be incredibly quick, but whether or not he's going to have the consistency, this is his first season in Formula One, so it's maybe not going to be a complete package from him yet. So you'd kind of need George to have better pace to pick up the pieces from Kimi Antonelli if he is to make mistakes and whatnot. But as I say, a very strong lineup. I'm just not sure how consistent it's going to be. So B tier for the Mercedes guys. Racing Bulls next with Yuki Tsunoda and Isaac Hadjar. I've got them down as D tier. Tsunoda has just missed out on that Red Bull seat alongside Max Verstappen for next year. They've gone with Liam Lawson instead of him. I think that Yuki Tsunoda has had a strong 2024. I certainly thought that he deserved to get that Red Bull seat for next year. But Red Bull clearly know something that we don't, that shows why they haven't promoted him. Perhaps it is that they just want a team leader to be at that Racing Bulls team. If it were to be just Liam Lawson and Isaac Hadjar, that's quite an inexperienced team overall. So perhaps it is that. But there must be a reason why they haven't promoted him. And they've paired Yuki with Isaac Hadjar, as I mentioned, who's just finished second in the F2 Championship of 2023, just behind Gabriel Bortoleto, who we'll get onto later in the video. In terms of Yuki and Isaac as a package, one thing that they certainly have in common is that they are both quite hot-headed behind the wheel. Yuki has obviously had a good few seasons in Formula One to try and get that out of his driving. Isaac coming in fresh into Formula One. I'm expecting fireworks on the radio between those two. If they ever share the same piece of track together, it could go very horribly wrong for the Racing Bulls team next year. But I've put them in D tier and I've put them just above Alpine. I think that Gasly is overall a better driver than Tsunoda, but I would say that Hadjar shows more potential, in my opinion, than Jack Doohan for next year anyway. So they're very close, but I've put Racing Bulls just above Alpine. Red Bull next with Max Verstappen and Liam Lawson. I've got them in A tier. Max Verstappen in 2024, once again proving that he is the best driver in Formula One right now. That's not a shock to anyone. If you had a team of two Max Verstappens, then it's an obvious S tier. But paired alongside Liam Lawson, very inexperienced in Formula One. He's technically not a rookie because obviously he has competed in a couple of F1 seasons now, completing 11 races over the course of the last 2 seasons. He must have impressed Red Bull enough to have the faith in him to go up against Max for next year, but I think the general consensus was that Yuki Tsunoda was maybe the right choice over him. But as I said earlier, Red Bull obviously knows something that we don't in that regard. In terms of Verstappen and Lawson, it wouldn't surprise me terribly if we saw another round of Verstappen versus Gasly or Verstappen versus Albon, because Verstappen just tends to destroy teammates. So for Liam's sake, you'd kind of hope that he is going to be able to at least take it to Max in a couple of races throughout the year. The issue that he might have is that Red Bull are no longer the dominant force that they once were. In the 2022 and 23 seasons, we saw Perez managing to finish second in the championship despite the fact that he was miles off Max Verstappen, and then he was found out last year by the fact that he was no longer really able to finish in the points towards the end of the season. So if Red Bull continue that end of 2024 performance into next year, it could be quite a big struggle for Liam. I do think that Max will still be able to extract the most out of that car, probably still end up in a title fight, let's be honest. But yeah, overall, Red Bull, A tier. The Sauber team now with Nico Hülkenberg and Gabriel Bortoleto, I'm putting in C tier. Hülkenberg is coming off the back of an incredible 2024 season. Many people's best driver of the not top 4 teams, consistently scoring points throughout the season, consistently outperforming where that Haas car looked to be. He demolished Kevin Magnussen over the course of last season. And Gabriel Bortoleto also having an incredibly strong 2024, winning the Formula 2 Championship. I feel like Sauber, after the dreadful season that they've just had, scoring points on only one occasion, they've definitely upgraded their driver lineup. I'd say Hülkenberg and Bortoleto is a lot more exciting as a prospect than Bottas and Zhou. The issue that they might have is that they've obviously got a lot of gremlins in that car. They seem to start to work them out towards the end of the season when they did manage to get the points. But having an entirely fresh driver lineup going into next year, there's not that continuity of driver to maybe be able to spot and recognise what's wrong with the car and maybe what's right with the car if they do make changes, because they won't have had much experience in the car from last year. But saying that, Hulkenberg, very strong. Bortoleto, I'm expecting to be very strong. I hope that they manage to be quite close throughout the season, because I really do rate Gabriel Bortoleto. And I've got them in C tier, just above the Haas guys, but just below Aston Martin, because I do think that Alonso is that strong that he sort of brings the Astons up. But of course, you're more than welcome to let me know what you guys think in the comments, and I'm sure that you will. And lastly, but certainly not least, we've got Williams, who have Carlos Sainz and Alexander Albon for next year, and I've got them rated in A tier. I think that Sainz has just had a very good 2024, possibly quite underrated. The fact that he came into the season knowing that he was leaving the Ferrari team, and then to go on and have the season that he did, getting the wins that he did, he wasn't terribly far off Charles Leclerc, who, as I mentioned earlier, I think is one of the best drivers on the grid. And I'd say he definitely wasn't deserving of losing his seat at the Scuderia, but he's jumped ship to Williams alongside Alexander Albon, who has been at that team for a decent amount of time now, really embedded in the project that they seem to be in for going forward. Albon's teammates in the past, of course, being quite weak with Latifi and Sargent, and then Colapinto came along and he seemed to have the measure of beating him. But of course, Sainz is a very different prospect for Albon. I do expect Sainz to outperform Albon over the season, but I think that the combination of the two of those drivers with the experience they have in Formula One, Sainz obviously driving for massive teams such as Ferrari and McLaren in the past, Albon's been at Red Bull before, you'd hope that amalgamating all of that experience into the one team at Williams should be a decent leapfrog for them to go forward and up the grid. And when you look at the teams that Sainz has been at before, and when you look at where they were before he joined and where they were after he joined, it seems that Sainz is very good at developing teams and developing cars. It should be a very big positive to have him in the Williams car for next year. And I'd say overall, this is an incredibly strong driver lineup, hence I've put them in A. I've put them just above the Red Bull team because I think that Sainz and Albon as an overall package is better than Verstappen and Lawson, of course, Verstappen being an elite tier driver. The only thing that stops Albon and Sainz from moving into that S tier is that they're just missing out on that really elite tier driver. That true, pure, out and out, like fastest driver that's always going to perform at the top of his game. I do think that Carlos Sainz is an incredibly strong driver, but he's not that out and out number one. But maybe him at Williams will give him the chance to prove that he is that driver for going forward. So this is my completed tier list. I think it's generally looking like an incredibly strong grid for 2025. So the D tier, whilst it looks menacing and horrible, it's actually not that bad because all of this is just relative to the other team's drivers. Of course, let me know down in the comments below how you would rank the different teams for next year. And yeah, with that, Happy New Year everyone, and I will see you in the next one.